The plane hummed softly, its engines stirring the anticipation of passengers eager to get where they were going. Among them was a black family, parents with two small children, settling into their seats, their faces glowing with the usual mix of excitement and exhaustion that comes with air travel. The little boy tugged on his mother's arm, pointing out the window with wide eyes as she smiled and smoothed his hair. It should have been an ordinary flight, but what happened next would turn an otherwise mundane journey into a moment that everyone on board would never forget. It all started with a minor misunderstanding, the kind of thing that happens on flights all the time. A misplaced bag, a mix-up over seat assignments. Who hasn't dealt with that while traveling? The father politely explained their situation to the flight attendant, his tone calm, his words measured. He just wanted to clear things up and get his family settled. But instead of helping, the flight attendant's expression hardened, her voice clipped and cold as she shot back a response. Her demeanor wasn't just impatient, it was something else, something that made heads turn and brows furrow. At first, the other passengers tried to ignore it, assuming it would blow over. The tension escalated quickly. The father's calm explanations were met with hostility. His wife's quiet attempts to mediate were brushed aside, and the children, too young to fully understand what was happening, began to fidget in their seats, sensing the unease around them. A quiet ripple of discomfort spread through the cabin. Whispers started to travel from row to row. People exchanged uneasy glances, their curiosity and concern growing with each moment. The situation reached a boiling point when the flight attendant demanded the family leave the plane. Her voice rang out sharply, cutting through the murmurs of the passengers like a knife. "You need to gather your things and exit immediately," she said, her tone leaving no room for discussion. The father looked stunned, his composure cracking under the weight of her words. "But why?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. His question hung in the air, unanswered, as the flight attendant stood there, her arms crossed, her stance rigid and unyielding. Gasps filled the cabin. People craned their necks, trying to get a better view of the unfolding drama. What's going on? Someone whispered. Another passenger muttered, "This doesn't seem right." The atmosphere shifted from quiet curiosity to open outrage as the family gathered their belongings, their faces a mixture of humiliation and confusion. The little boy clutched his stuffed animal tightly, his eyes wide with fear, while his sister held her mother's hand, her lip trembling. As the family walked down the aisle toward the exit, the father turned back briefly, his eyes scanning the rows of passengers who sat frozen in their seats. He wasn't looking for pity or even sympathy, just understanding. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something, but he didn't. Instead, he tightened his grip on the handle of his carry-on bag and kept walking. The sound of their footsteps echoed loudly in the hushed cabin. But this story doesn't end there. Just 4 minutes later, something happened that no one, least of all the flight attendants, could have predicted. The very person who had ordered the family off the plane was about to face consequences she couldn't have imagined, and it all unfolded right there, in front of everyone. What led to this shocking turn of events? What was the final straw that made her actions impossible to ignore? And how did the other passengers play a role in what came next? Stay tuned, because this story is only just beginning, and the twists ahead will leave you speechless. The cabin was silent, save for the faint hum of the plane's air conditioning and the occasional rustle of someone shifting in their seat. Eyes darted around nervously, passengers unsure of what to say or do after witnessing the family's walk of shame. There was an unspoken consensus in the air, a shared discomfort that prickled at everyone's sense of decency. A few people exchanged murmurs, their voices low and uncertain. "Did you see how she spoke to them?" A woman whispered to her seatmate, shaking her head. "I don't get it," the man beside her replied, leaning in closer. It didn't even seem upset at first. He was just asking about the seats, wasn't he? "It didn't feel right," another voice chimed in, this one coming from a few rows back. Meanwhile, the flight attendant in question stood near the front of the cabin, her posture tense. She fiddled with the tablet in her hand, pretending to review passenger information, but the red flush creeping up her neck gave her away. She'd felt the weight of every pair of eyes on her as the family walked off the plane, and she could still feel them now. Her hands trembled slightly, though she masked it with a quick, purposeful movement to adjust her blazer. What had started as a minor inconvenience, a simple question about seating, had spiraled out of control faster than she'd anticipated. There was something about the father's calm tone, the way he hadn't gotten angry or raised his voice, that made her feel challenged, like he was questioning her authority without even trying to. She hadn't meant to escalate things, not really, but once the words left her mouth, she couldn't take them back. Still, she told herself she was just doing her job. Passengers had to follow the rules. If they didn't, there were consequences. That's how it worked. But the small, nagging voice in the back of her mind wouldn't let up. Did she overreact? Was she too quick to shut him down? And why was everyone looking at her like that? In the back of the plane, an older man with salt and pepper hair leaned forward in his seat. He'd been watching everything unfold with a heavy heart, and now he couldn't stay silent any longer. Clearing his throat, he turned to the woman seated beside him. "You saw what happened, right?" he asked. She nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Yeah, that was hard to watch." "It didn't sit right with me," the man continued. "I've flown enough times to know when someone's just being difficult, and that wasn't it. That family didn't do anything wrong." The woman sighed, glancing toward the front of the plane where the flight attendant was still stationed. She didn't give them a chance to explain. She just decided. "And the kids? Did you see how scared they looked?" The man nodded gravely. "It's not just about them, though. It's about all of us. If someone can be treated like that, so unfairly, what does it say about the rest of us? Are we supposed to just sit here and let it happen?" His words seemed to hang in the air, resonating with the passengers around him. More people began to speak up, their voices growing louder and more confident as they found strength in each other. The whispers turned into murmurs, and the murmurs into scattered statements of frustration and disbelief. Someone should say something. This isn't right. They deserve an apology, at the very least. But while the passengers were processing their own feelings about what had just happened, another layer of the story was unfolding on the other side of the boarding gate. The family, now standing in the waiting area with their carry-ons in hand, was being approached by a different airline employee. This woman, wearing a badge that read Manager of Customer Relations, had rushed to the scene the moment she heard about the incident from a gate agent. Her face was filled with concern as she approached the father, who was now crouched down, speaking softly to his children in an effort to comfort them. The mother stood beside him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes darting between the manager and the plane they'd just been forced to leave. "I'm so sorry to interrupt," the manager began, her voice gentle but firm. "I just heard about what happened, and I want to assure you we're looking into it right away." The father stood, his expression guarded but composed. "I appreciate you coming over," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of the situation. "But my family has just been humiliated in front of a plane full of people. How do you plan to fix that?" The manager hesitated, knowing there was no easy answer to his question. "I understand how you feel," she said carefully. "What happened to you shouldn't have happened. I'm going to make sure this is addressed immediately." The mother, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke up. "This isn't just about us," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's about how people are treated, how some people are treated. My children didn't deserve to see this. No one does." The manager nodded, her eyes softening as she took in the family's palpable frustration and pain. "You're absolutely right," she said. "And I promise, we'll make this right. Please, give me just a moment." She stepped away briefly to make a call, her voice low but urgent as she spoke into her phone. Back on the plane, however, the atmosphere was growing increasingly tense. Passengers were no longer whispering. They were openly voicing their concerns. A young woman, near the middle of the cabin, pulled out her phone and started recording, her lens trained on the flight attendant, who was now visibly flustered. "What's happening now?" someone asked from across the aisle. "I think the airline is going to have to step in," another person replied. "This has gotten way too big to ignore." It was then that an announcement crackled over the intercom, drawing everyone's attention. The captain's voice came through, calm and professional, but with a distinct undertone of urgency. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I want to thank you all for your patience as we work through a situation on board. Please remain in your seats, and we'll have an update for you shortly." The announcement did little to quell the unrest. If anything, it only heightened the tension. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, their unease growing by the second. And then, just as the murmurs began to pick up again, the door to the cabin opened, and the manager of customer relations stepped inside. Her entrance was swift and purposeful, her eyes scanning the rows of passengers before landing on the flight attendant. Without hesitation, she walked up to her, leaned in, and said something that no one else could hear. Whatever it was, it caused the flight attendant's face to pale instantly. The murmurs in the cabin stopped as people strained to see what was happening. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that makes your heart race even when you don't fully understand why. And then, as if in slow motion, the flight attendant nodded curtly, turned on her heel, and walked out of the cabin, her steps quick and determined. The manager stayed behind, addressing the passengers with a calm but firm tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to apologize on behalf of the airline for the incident that occurred today. We take these matters very seriously, and we're committed to making this right. We appreciate your patience as we work through this." The passengers exchanged glances, their curiosity piqued, but their questions still unanswered. What had the manager said to the flight attendant? Why had she left so abruptly? And most importantly, what would happen next? The story was far from over, and the resolution, whatever it might be, would have to wait. For now, all anyone could do was sit with the tension, the questions, and the uneasy feeling that justice was still hanging in the balance. As the flight attendant exited the cabin, the tension inside the plane remained thick, like a storm brewing in slow motion. Passengers whispered among themselves, their voices carrying a mix of disbelief and curiosity. The young woman who had started recording earlier glanced at the man seated beside her. "Do you think they'd fired her just now?" she asked, her phone still in her hand. "Sure looked like it," the man replied. She didn't even try to argue. Did you see her face? She knew she messed up. Near the back of the plane, the older man with salt and pepper hair leaned forward again, his brows furrowed. "That's not enough," he muttered, almost to himself. "What about the family? They're the ones who deserve answers." Meanwhile, outside the plane, the father paced near the boarding gate, his phone pressed to his ear. He was speaking to someone, maybe a friend, maybe a lawyer, but his tone was calm and deliberate, even as frustration flickered in his eyes. The mother sat a few feet away with the children, trying her best to keep them distracted. She handed them snacks from her bag, a smile forced but steady as she reassured them everything was fine. The little boy looked up at her, his face scrunched in confusion. "Mommy, are we still going on the trip?" he asked softly. She hesitated, her heart sinking at the question. "Well, see, baby," she replied, brushing a hand over his curls. "Right now, we just have to wait a little bit." The airline manager who had entered the plane earlier now stood a short distance away, speaking with a few other staff members. She glanced at the family periodically, her expression a mix of concern and determination. Whatever she was planning, it was clear she knew this was more than just a customer service issue. This was something that could ripple far beyond the airport if handled poorly. Back on the plane, the captain stepped out of the cockpit, his presence drawing immediate attention. He approached the manager, who had returned to the cabin, and the two exchanged quiet words at the front of the plane. From the way they gestured and nodded, it was clear they were discussing the next steps. Passengers watched intently, their curiosity growing by the second. One man, sitting a few rows back, leaned over to his seatmate. "This feels bigger than just kicking someone off a flight," he said. "I think they're trying to figure out how to control the damage." "You're probably right," the woman beside him replied. "And honestly, it should be worried. It's not every day you see something like this play out in front of a full cabin." As the minutes ticked by, the atmosphere in the plane shifted from tense to restless. People began speculating openly, their voices blending into a low hum of chatter. Some passengers pulled out their phones, scrolling through social media to see if anyone had posted about the incident yet. Others simply stared out the windows, lost in thought. The young woman who had been recording earlier decided to take action. She opened her phone's camera again, this time turning it on herself. "So, we're still on the plane," she began, her voice quiet but firm. "For those of you just tuning in, a black family was just kicked off our flight for no apparent reason. And now the flight attendant who did it is gone too. We don't know if she was fired or just removed, but either way, people are upset. Stay tuned. I'll keep you posted." She uploaded the video to her social media account, her hands shaking slightly as she hit the post button. Within moments, notifications started pouring in. Friends and strangers alike began commenting, their reactions ranging from outrage to disbelief. "What airline is this?" One comment read, "How is this still happening in 2025? Another asked. The situation was quickly gaining momentum, but inside the plane, the story was far from over. The airline manager returned to the gate area where the family was still waiting. She approached the father first, her voice low and calm. "Sir, I want to thank you for your patience," she said. "I've spoken with the captain and our team, and we're working on a solution. We're deeply sorry for what happened to you and your family." The father looked at her, his expression unreadable. "And what does working on a solution mean?" he asked. "Because right now, all I see is my family sitting here, embarrassed and humiliated, while the plane is still getting ready to leave without us." The manager winced slightly but maintained her composure. "I completely understand," she said. "Please know that our priority is making this right. If you'd like, I'd be happy to sit down with you and go over everything in detail." Before the father could respond, the mother stood up, her voice steady but firm. "This isn't just about going over details," she said. "This is about how we were treated, how our children were treated. No one deserves to be spoken to like that, let alone kicked off a plane for no reason. What are you going to do to fix that?" The manager opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, one of the children spoke up. "Are we in trouble?" the little boy asked, his voice small and unsure. The question hit like a punch to the gut. The manager's expression softened, and even the father, who had been holding himself together so well, seemed momentarily shaken. He crouched down beside his son, his voice gentle but firm. "Nobody," he said. "You're not in trouble. None of us are. This isn't your fault." The boy nodded, though he didn't seem entirely convinced. His sister reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly as they stood together. The manager took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. "You're absolutely right," she said, addressing the parents once more. "This never should have happened, and we're going to take immediate action to make sure it doesn't happen again. Please just give me a few more moments to finalize everything." As she walked away, the father exchanged a glance with his wife. "We'll see what they actually do," he said quietly. The mother nodded, her expression grim. "I'm not holding my breath," she replied. Back on the plane, the passengers were growing more vocal. Someone near the front of the cabin raised their voice, addressing the crew directly. "Are we just going to sit here and act like nothing happened?" they asked. A murmur of agreement spread through the cabin. The young woman who had been recording earlier stood up slightly in her seat, her phone still in hand. "We need to know what's going on," she called out. "People have a right to understand why that family was treated the way they were." The crew exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to respond. The captain, still standing near the front of the plane, cleared his throat and addressed the passengers once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, I understand your concerns, and I assure you we're doing everything we can to address the situation. Please bear with us as we work to resolve this matter." But the captain's words did little to quell the growing unrest. Passengers continued to voice their frustration, their voices blending into a cacophony of indignation. It was clear that the situation was far from over, and the resolution, whatever it might be, would only come after more questions were asked, more tensions were explored, and more truths were uncovered.